White Fang is an adaptation of Jack London's novel of the same name. We started working on it in 2014-15. So yeah, it's basically about a wolf dog growing up in the wild with his mother and being used and abused by certain humans, and in the end finding solace among other humans that treat him better. So I'm not going to spoil the ending, but yeah, that's pretty much it. This is one of the cases where there was already a pre-existing screenplay. I read a few. This one was the first one for a film that I felt that I wanted to do, because it felt very different from all the animation films that I see in cinemas at the moment. I have to say, like, the first thing that interested me was that it had very little dialogue, and that from the script, while reading it, I could tell that everything was in the images. I could tell the story without too many words. Second thing was I felt that I could do a Western. I'm a huge Italian Western fan, and I felt that I could build in some of the elements that I know from Sergio Leone, Sergio Corbucci movies into this. It's very subtle. I mean, it's still a family and a kids film, but yeah, so I tried to build in as much as I could from these influences that I have. Well, there's one thing is that the design, and the other one is like the animation technique that we use. So in terms of design, there had already been some preliminary designs that had been made, which were sent to me with the script, which I liked a lot, so I didn't want to change them. And already the characters had this very specific type of faces that we know. Like, they were very angular, while most animated films tend to be very rounded and very soft. The style was really rough, and I liked that, so I decided to go with that basic idea and just develop it throughout all of the movie and all the other characters. So yeah, what I liked was that the grittiness of the story was reflected in the characters' design. So the characters were, like I said, angular. You could see the brush strokes in their faces, and I really liked it because, like, the story mirrored the look of the characters and vice versa. The other thing was the technique that we used. We used a motion capture technique to animate our human characters and some of the dog, the main character. So we put a motion capture suit on humans, obviously, to do all these massive scenes. We have a couple of scenes that have 50 plus characters, and motion capture is a lot easier for that. Also, the designs of the characters are very realistic in terms of proportion. So it felt natural to use real actors to do their movements. But then we also tried to go with the dog, see what we could do. And we had the dog trainer on set. We had a custom-made suit for the dog, motion capture suit. The dog felt a bit restricted at first because the suit was on his whole body. So we had to cut out pieces so he could move more freely. But we managed to get a bunch of really good shots because we had also a good dog trainer who was able to get all the motions that we needed. And we ended up using him quite a bit in some of the scenes. But obviously some of the more complex scenes, especially when White Fang is a puppy and he's really young, we had to animate everything by hand. This is my first feature film. Something that I had to learn is that things need to be repeated a lot. So I was always in the impression that you tell things once and they get understood, and then things evolve and move on from there. But over the course of the production, which is for an animated film is like 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 years, information gets lost. So you always have to kickstart this information process again. You have to make meetings, tell people again and again. It's not that people are dumb or anything. It's just like information tend to get lost in translation. People get sucked up by their work, start getting tunnel vision, and get so caught up in what they're doing that sometimes you have to show them the bigger picture again for everybody to understand what we're working on. It's the same for me. I mean, I sometimes had to get back to the script, to the storyboard that we had in order to remind myself, okay, this is what we're doing, this is what we're getting at. Because along the course of the production, you get new ideas, and in the end, if you look at it as a whole, you get reminded that it's not that important. You just let it slide. It's just a small detail. I would make a difference between what's happening in Europe and the US and Japan. I think Japan as a country are closer to what we are doing in Europe. their movies are very similar in look very often. I mean, it's a style that's immediately recognizable, but in terms of the narrative, they're very different. So there's a multitude of stories that are explored in Japan. And in Europe, I think we have the same type of thing where here the difference we have is that techniques get explored also, different techniques, different looks. Pretty much every animated film that comes out of Europe has a different look and a different technique that's being used and is very unique. And I think there's also a freedom of expression that we have in Europe. We might not have the budgets, but we have a freedom of expression that US productions don't have. I think their budget is something that limits them in terms of how far they can go with stories. I think people have gotten used to certain types of stories. And it's not only in the US, I think in Europe also people have become used to a certain American way of telling stories. And with certain beats in the stories that are expected, with a happy ending and everything. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying it's a very formative way of making movies. And the Americans are very good at it. In fact, I think certain European productions could also take some lessons from the Americans because we tend to be very artsy in Europe. But I think that's where the main difference lies, is that we don't have the money, but we tend to be more creative because of it. And I think American movies don't have the luxury of going that far in terms of storytelling because their budgets limit them, because they have to make back their money. So they have to go they have to walk the beaten path because that's what people know and that's what people expect.